The blazing Arizona sun had long been Elizabeth Taylor's enemy, but on the day she buried her husband, it felt like a punishment from God himself. The heat beat down mercilessly as the last shovelful of dirt fell upon Richard's grave, sealing away the man who had both protected and controlled her for the past 7 years. At 25, Elizabeth Betsy, to those who knew her before her marriage, stood as the youngest widow in Copper Creek, a dusty mining town that had seen better days before the silver veins ran thin in 1872. "Lord's taken him to a better place," Reverend Mitchell offered, patting her gloved hand with his papery fingers. Elizabeth nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced the Lord had much to do with the saloon brawl that left Richard with a knife between his ribs. The small gathering of mourners began to disperse, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the crude wooden cross that now marked her husband's final resting place. "Mrs. Taylor," Sheriff Holden approached, hat respectfully clutched in his hands. "I wanted to offer my condolences." Richard was a fine businessman. Elizabeth bit her tongue to keep from correcting him. Richard Taylor had been many things: a saloon owner, a gambler, a man quick to anger, but fine wasn't a word she'd use. Instead, she nodded, maintaining the proper widow's demeanor. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Have you made any progress finding the man responsible?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Well now, Mrs. Taylor, these things take time. Witnesses say the fella was just passing through, probably halfway to Mexico by now. 3 men saw what happened. They all said Richard accused him of cheating, but the stranger's cards were clean." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Taylor, I understand you're grieving, but perhaps it's best to leave the investigation to those equipped to handle it." Elizabeth felt a familiar burn in her chest, the same one she'd felt whenever Richard had silenced her opinions at dinner parties or social gatherings. The one she'd promised herself she'd never ignore again. Those equipped to handle it seem remarkably uninterested in finding justice for a murdered man, she said, voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Now, Mrs. Taylor, Sheriff, my husband may have started that fight, but he didn't deserve to die for it. I simply want to know who's responsible." Sheriff Holden replaced his hat, his expression hardening. "I'd advise you to mind your place, Mrs. Taylor. A widow should be focused on prayer and mourning, not stirring up trouble." As he walked away, Elizabeth felt the weight of the town's expectations pressing down upon her shoulders. A proper widow. Quiet, demure, grateful for the condolences and casseroles that would sustain her through her period of mourning. Richard would have expected the same, but Richard was dead. 2 weeks after the funeral, Elizabeth sat behind the heavy oak desk in what had been her husband's office at the back of the Silver Spur Saloon. The ledgers spread before her told a troubling story. Richard's financial affairs were in disarray: gambling debts, unpaid suppliers, and loans from people whose names she didn't recognize. The saloon itself was profitable, but Richard had been siphoning money faster than it could come in. A knock at the door interrupted her calculations. "Enter," she called, straightening her black mourning dress. Harold Weathers, the bank manager, stepped in, his round face pinched with discomfort. "Mrs. Taylor, I trust you're bearing up as well as can be expected." "I'm managing, Mr. Weathers. Please have a seat." He perched awkwardly on the chair across from her, placing his leather portfolio on the desk. "I've come about the matter of the loan." "Loan?" Elizabeth frowned. "Which loan would that be?" "The one secured against this establishment. Your husband borrowed a considerable sum 6 months ago." "I'm afraid it's come due." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "I see, and how considerable is this sum?" When Weathers named the figure, Elizabeth struggled to maintain her composure. It was nearly everything the saloon would make in a year of good business. "I understand this comes as a shock," Weathers continued, "but business is business. The bank requires payment within 30 days or we'll be forced to take possession of the saloon." Elizabeth's mind raced. "Surely there must be some arrangement we can come to." "My husband's only been in the ground 2 weeks, which is precisely why I've waited to approach you out of respect. Most widows would be grateful for such consideration." His tone carried a hint of rebuke. "Most widows aren't left with a failing business and debts they knew nothing about." Elizabeth countered, Weathers' expression soured. Mrs. Taylor, may I speak frankly? Please do. The sensible thing would be to sell the saloon now, while you still can, and use the proceeds to clear the debt. A woman alone has no business running an establishment like this. It's unseemly. Elizabeth's back stiffened. Unseemly or not, this saloon is all I have. Perhaps you might consider remarrying. I understand George Peterson has been widowed nearly a year now. He has a prosperous ranch and only 3 children to raise. Weathers offered this as if presenting a gift. I've only just buried my husband, Mr. Weathers. Of course, of course. But practical matters must be addressed, Mrs. Taylor. A woman in your position has limited options. After Weathers left, Elizabeth sat in the growing darkness of the office, her mind churning. The bank wouldn't extend the loan to a widow with no collateral. No one would buy the saloon for enough to cover the debts, especially not with the mine's reduced operations. And she'd sooner move back east to her disapproving parents than marry George Peterson, a man 30 years her senior who was rumored to have driven his first wife to an early grave with his temper. There was only one option: make the Silver Spur profitable enough to pay off the debt herself. The next morning, Elizabeth rose before dawn, donned her simplest black dress, and made her way to the saloon. The early hour meant the streets of Copper Creek were nearly deserted, save for a few miners heading to the early shift and shopkeepers preparing to open for the day. Inside the Silver Spur, she found Hank, the elderly bartender who had worked for Richard for years, already polishing glasses. Mrs. Taylor, he said, surprise evident in his rheumy eyes. Didn't expect to see you so early, or at all, if I'm being honest. I need to understand how everything works, Hank, from opening to closing and everything in between. The old man's bushy eyebrows rose. You planning on selling, madam? No, I'm planning on running it. Hank let out a low whistle. Begging your pardon, Mrs. Taylor, but that ain't going to sit well with folks around here. It doesn't need to sit well with them. It just needs to keep a roof over my head and food on my table. For the next several hours, Hank walked her through the daily operations, how much whiskey to pour for different prices, which suppliers delivered when, how to spot a card cheat, and which customers were trouble. Elizabeth took meticulous notes, asking questions and absorbing every detail. By midday, word had spread through Copper Creek that the widow Taylor was behind the bar at the Silver Spur. By evening, the saloon was busier than usual, though Elizabeth suspected it was more out of curiosity than loyalty to her establishment. She stood behind the bar, serving drinks alongside Hank, ignoring the stares and whispers. Most of the miners and cowboys were respectful enough, if somewhat bemused by her presence. A few made crude comments just loud enough for her to hear, testing her resolve. Never thought I'd see the day a woman's pouring my whiskey, drawled Emmett Collins, a rancher from outside town. Especially not one still in widow's weeds. Would you prefer your whiskey served with tears or smelling salts, Mr. Collins? Elizabeth replied coolly, sliding his drink across the bar. A few men nearby chuckled, and Collins' face reddened. You've got a sharp tongue for a grieving widow, he muttered. And you've got a dull wit for a grown man, she countered before moving on to the next customer. The exchange set the tone for the evening. Elizabeth served drinks efficiently, rebuffed unwanted advances firmly, and gradually earned a grudging respect from most of the patrons. But as the night wore on and the whiskey flowed freely, the atmosphere grew tense. Sheriff Holden pushed through the batwing doors just after 9, surveying the crowded room before making his way to the bar. Mrs. Taylor, he said, his voice carrying over the din of conversation and piano music. A word, if you please. Elizabeth gestured for Hank to take over and followed the sheriff to a quiet corner. This isn't appropriate, Holden began without preamble. A respectable widow has no business tending bar in a saloon. It's my saloon, Sheriff. It was your husband's saloon. And now that he's gone, it's high time you considered your reputation. Elizabeth's patience, already stretched thin by the long day, finally snapped. My reputation? Sheriff, I'm trying to save the only source of income I have. The bank is ready to take everything unless I can make this place profitable. There are other ways, such as marrying the first man who offers, begging for charity, selling myself instead of whiskey." Her voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. The sheriff's face darkened. "You're causing a scene, Mrs. Taylor. I'm defending my livelihood. You're making trouble just like you did at the funeral with your questions about Richard's killer." The saloon had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation in the corner. "I'm making a living," Elizabeth said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And if asking questions about my husband's murder or running my own business makes me trouble, then so be it." A slow clapping sound broke the tension. Elizabeth turned to see a tall man leaning against the far wall, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. He stepped forward into the lamplight, revealing rugged features weathered by sun and wind, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Sounds to me like she's just being brave," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "And sensible, too. Nothing wrong with a widow making her own way." Sheriff Holden's hand drifted toward his gun belt. "And who might you be?" The stranger smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Name's Ethan Abbott, just passing through on my way north." "Well, Mr. Abbott, this is a local matter, and I'd appreciate you keeping your opinions to yourself." Ethan shrugged, seemingly unconcerned by the sheriff's hostility. "Just speaking my mind, same as the lady here." He tipped his hat to Elizabeth. "Madam," Sheriff Holden glared at them both before stomping out of the saloon, muttering about troublemakers and decent folk. As conversation gradually resumed around them, Elizabeth approached the stranger. "Thank you for the support, Mr. Abbott, though I fear you've made an enemy of our sheriff." "Wouldn't be the first lawman to take a dislike to me," Ethan replied with an easy smile. "Besides, I meant what I said. Takes courage to stand up for yourself in a town like this." Elizabeth studied him more carefully. He wasn't flashily dressed like a gambler, nor did he have the rough appearance of a cowhand or miner. His clothes were well-worn but clean, and the gun at his hip looked like a tool rather than an ornament. "What brings you to Copper Creek, Mr. Abbott?" "There's not much here anymore now that the mine's running dry. Just passing through, like I said. Thought I'd rest a few days before heading on." He glanced around the saloon. "Might be able to find some work while I'm here. Work is scarce these days." "I'm handy with horses, cards, or a hammer, whatever needs doing." His eyes met hers directly. "I get the impression you might need an extra pair of hands around here." Elizabeth hesitated. Hiring a drifter she just met wasn't the wisest move, but good help was indeed hard to find, especially for a woman in her position. "I can't pay much," she said finally. "I don't need much. Room, meals, and enough to keep my horse fed would do for now. There's a small room behind the kitchen." "It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." Elizabeth wasn't sure why she was offering so quickly, but something about Ethan Abbott's steady gaze made her feel she could trust him. "I'll take it," he said, extending his hand, "and I'll earn my keep, Mrs. Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor." His hand was warm and calloused around hers. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Taylor. Sounds like you've got a reputation for trouble." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "I've always had a fondness for trouble." Elizabeth withdrew her hand, ignoring the sudden flutter in her chest. "The room will be ready tomorrow. You can start by fixing the back porch steps. They've been broken for months." "Yes, madam." Ethan tipped his hat again before turning to the bar to order a drink. Elizabeth watched him go, wondering if she'd just made a terrible mistake or found exactly the help she needed. Either way, Ethan Abbott wasn't what she'd expected to find in Copper Creek, and for the first time since Richard's death, she felt something other than grief or fear, a small spark of hope that perhaps she wasn't entirely alone in her fight. The next morning, Elizabeth was surprised to find Ethan already at work on the back steps when she arrived at the saloon. The early dawn light cast long shadows across the yard as he measured and cut lumber with practiced efficiency. "You're an early riser, Mr. Abbott," she called as she approached. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow with his sleeve. "Old habit from ranch days. Best to get the heavy work done before the sun's high." "Ranch days? I thought you were just passing through." "Been passing through most places for the better part of 10 years, he replied with a half smile. But I grew up on a cattle ranch in Texas, left when I was 18, been drifting ever since. Elizabeth unlocked the back door of the saloon. Well, I appreciate the initiative. There's coffee inside once you're ready for a break. Throughout the morning, Elizabeth worked on the ledgers while keeping one eye on Ethan through the window. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew his trade, finishing the steps before midday and moving on to fix a leaking water barrel without being asked. By the time the saloon opened at noon, Ethan had accomplished more repairs than Richard had in their last year of marriage. He came inside as the first customers arrived, his shirt damp with sweat and sawdust clinging to his dark hair. "The room behind the kitchen is ready for you," Elizabeth told him. "There's a wash basin and fresh towels." "Much obliged," he said. "After I clean up, I'd be happy to help with whatever else you need." That evening, the Silver Spur was even busier than the night before. Word had spread about the widow who stood up to the sheriff, and it seemed half the town had come to see for themselves. Elizabeth moved efficiently behind the bar while Ethan helped Hank serve drinks and kept a watchful eye on the more rowdy patrons. She couldn't help but notice how differently the men behaved with Ethan present. There were fewer crude comments, more respectful madams, and even a few genuine conversations about the business. Whether it was Ethan's imposing height, the quiet confidence with which he moved, or the gun he wore low on his hip, his presence changed the dynamic of the room. Just after 8, the batwing doors swung open to admit Harold Weathers and 2 other members of the town council. The banker spotted Elizabeth immediately and made his way to the bar, his expression sour. "Mrs. Taylor, I need to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." Elizabeth nodded to Hank to take over and led Weathers to a corner table. "What can I do for you, Mr. Weathers?" "It's what you've already done that concerns us," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Your behavior is causing quite a stir in Copper Creek. Running a saloon, serving drinks to miners and cowboys, it's unseemly for a woman of your standing." "My standing as a widow with debts to pay, that standing, Mr. Weathers," the banker's face flushed. "You know very well what I mean. There are standards of propriety in this town, and you're flouting them shamelessly. Is there a law against a woman running her own business? No law, perhaps, but there are unwritten rules that conveniently keep women dependent on men," Elizabeth interrupted. "I'm not interested in those rules, Mr. Weathers. I'm interested in keeping a roof over my head and paying off the loan your bank so generously extended to my late husband." Weathers leaned forward, lowering his voice at last. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Taylor. This can't continue. I've had complaints from respectable citizens, concerns about the moral character of our town. The moral character of Copper Creek was well established long before I started pouring drinks," Elizabeth said dryly, "unless you've forgotten about the brothel just 2 blocks from your bank. That's different because men run it, or because you frequent it." Weathers recoiled as if slapped. "How dare you? This is exactly the kind of troublemaking behavior that's causing such concern. The only trouble I'm making is for men who think they can dictate my choices now that my husband is gone." Elizabeth stood, smoothing her black skirt. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have customers to serve." As she turned to leave, Weathers grabbed her wrist. "This isn't over, Mrs. Taylor. The town council will be discussing your situation at our next meeting. Let go of me, Mr. Weathers." "Not until you understand the seriousness." A shadow fell across the table as Ethan appeared beside them. "The lady asked you to let go," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the polite words. Weathers released Elizabeth's wrist as if it had suddenly caught fire. "And who might you be?" "Someone who believes a gentleman should respect a lady's wishes," Ethan replied evenly. "Especially when she's his creditor." The banker stood, straightening his vest with trembling hands. "This establishment is hardly respectable anymore, and neither is its proprietress. The bank will be reassessing its position on the loan." "You do that," Elizabeth said calmly. "And I'll be happy to share what I've found in my husband's private correspondence about certain financial arrangements between him and members of the town council." It was a bluff. She'd found no such thing, but the flash of panic in Weathers' eyes told her the arrow had struck home. The banker hurried away without another word, nearly colliding with a customer in his haste to leave. Elizabeth released a shaky breath once he was gone. "Thank you for intervening, Mr. Abbott." "Ethan," he corrected gently, "and it was my pleasure." Men like that rely on intimidation because they have little else to offer. "Well, I appreciate it nonetheless, Ethan." She met his gaze, noticing for the first time the faint scar that ran along his jawline, "though I fear I've just made another enemy." "Seems to me you're collecting them faster than most." His eyes crinkled with humor. "Must be doing something right." A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. "Or something terribly wrong. Standing up for yourself is never wrong, Mrs. Taylor." "Elizabeth," she offered in return. "Or Betsy, as I was known before I married." "Betsy," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "It suits you better than Mrs. Taylor, if you don't mind my saying so." Before she could respond, a crash from the bar demanded her attention. She hurried away, aware of Ethan's eyes following her across the room and equally aware of the curious glances from patrons who had witnessed their exchange. For the next week, Elizabeth and Ethan fell into an easy routine. He spent mornings repairing the saloon's long-neglected maintenance issues and afternoons helping with inventory and supplies. In the evenings, he moved through the saloon with quiet authority, breaking up potential fights before they began and charming the customers with card tricks and the occasional story. Business improved steadily. Word spread that the Silver Spur served the best whiskey at fair prices, and Elizabeth's growing reputation for straight talk and fair dealing brought in customers from neighboring towns. She made a point of remembering names and preferences, treating each patron with respect regardless of their station. What surprised her most was how quickly she came to rely on Ethan's presence. It wasn't just the physical security he provided or his skill with repairs. It was the way he listened when she spoke, offering suggestions without trying to take over. The way he seemed to anticipate what she needed before she asked. The quiet conversations they shared after closing when the saloon was empty save for Hank snoring in the corner. She learned that Ethan had fought briefly for the Confederacy despite his family's objections, had traveled as far north as Montana and as far west as California, and could speak passable Spanish and enough Comanche to trade with the tribes. He was 32, had never married, and carried a book of poetry in his saddlebag alongside his spare ammunition. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a successful merchant who had expected her to make an advantageous match. About meeting Richard when he came east looking for investors for his mining ventures, how his charm and worldliness had swept her off her feet. How different the reality of marriage had been from her girlish dreams. "He wasn't cruel," she explained one night as they sat on the newly repaired back porch, watching the stars emerge above the mountains. "Not in the way some men are. He never raised a hand to me, but he was controlling. Everything had to be his way on his terms." "That's its own kind of cruelty," Ethan observed quietly. Elizabeth nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I didn't realize how small my world had become until he was gone, how many parts of myself I'd tucked away to keep the peace. And now I'm finding those pieces again. Some fit differently than before, some don't fit at all anymore, but they're mine to arrange as I choose." She smiled ruefully. "Even if that choice makes me trouble in the eyes of Copper Creek." Ethan's gaze was warm in the lantern light. "I've known a lot of trouble in my time, Betsy Taylor, and you're the finest kind there is." The compliment warmed her more than it should have, and Elizabeth found herself looking away, suddenly conscious of how close they were sitting, how intimate the conversation had become. "It's getting late," she said, rising from her chair, "and tomorrow will be busy." "It always is," Ethan agreed, standing as well. For a moment they faced each other in the soft glow of the lantern, the night sounds of the desert filling the silence between them. Then he stepped back, giving her space. "Good night, Betsy." "Good night, Ethan." As she made her way to her small house just behind the saloon, Elizabeth tried to ignore the fluttering in her chest. She was a widow not yet 2 months, still wearing the black of mourning. Whatever she might be feeling for Ethan Abbott was inappropriate, impractical, and almost certainly unwise. Yet as she prepared for bed, she couldn't help remembering the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how her name sounded in his low, gentle voice. For the first time since Richard's death, she fell asleep thinking not of debts or survival, but of possibilities. The town council meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday of the month, which gave Elizabeth nearly 2 weeks to prepare her defense. She knew Weathers and his cronies would use whatever means they could to force her out of business, whether through the loan, town ordinances, or social pressure. What she didn't expect was for the pressure to come from an entirely different direction. On Sunday morning, Elizabeth attended church as she always did, dressed in her best black gown and veiled hat. She sat in her usual pew near the back, ignoring the whispers and sidelong glances from the other parishioners. Reverend Mitchell had been cool toward her since she'd begun running the saloon, but he'd never openly criticized her from the pulpit, until today. "Brothers and sisters," the Reverend began after the opening hymns, "I feel compelled to address a matter of growing concern in our community. The Bible teaches us that women should be modest, submissive, and virtuous. The Proverbs tell us, 'Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies.'" Elizabeth kept her eyes forward, her back straight, though she could feel the congregation's attention shifting toward her. Yet we find ourselves in times where traditional values are being challenged, where the natural order established by God is undermined by worldly influences, Mitchell continued, his voice rising with righteous fervor. When women forsake their proper roles as nurturers and keepers of the home to engage in pursuits meant for men, they invite moral decay and corruption. The sermon continued in this vein for 20 minutes, never mentioning Elizabeth by name, but making it abundantly clear who was being condemned. By the time the Reverend called for the closing prayer, Elizabeth's hands were trembling with anger and humiliation. As the congregation rose to leave, a path cleared around her, as if her supposed moral failings might be contagious. Mothers pulled their children close, men averted their eyes, and the women who had brought her casseroles after Richard's death now turned their backs as she passed. Only Martha Wilson, the elderly widow who ran the town's small lending library, dared to meet her eye, giving Elizabeth a small, sympathetic nod as she passed. Outside the church, Elizabeth stood for a moment in the harsh sunlight, blinking back unexpected tears. She had anticipated resistance, even hostility, but the public shaming cut deeper than she'd expected. "Mrs. Taylor." She turned to find Sheriff Holden approaching, his expression grave beneath his Sunday hat. "Sheriff," she acknowledged stiffly. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about your new employee." Elizabeth frowned. "Mr. Abbott, what about him?" The sheriff glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I've been making some inquiries about your Mr. Abbott. Seems he's known in certain circles." "What circles would those be?" "The kind that involve wanted posters." Holden's eyes narrowed. "He's been careful about using different names, but the description matches. Ethan Abbott isn't his real name." Elizabeth's heart stuttered, but she kept her expression neutral. "What is he wanted for?" "Murder, among other things. Shot a man in El Paso last year, another in Denver before that. Do you have proof of these allegations? I'm waiting on confirmations from the territorial marshals, but I thought you should know the kind of man you've taken in." Elizabeth studied the sheriff's face, looking for signs of deception. Was this merely another attempt to undermine her, or was there truth to his claims? "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said carefully. "But until you have something more substantial than rumors, I'll continue to employ Mr. Abbott. He's been nothing but helpful and respectful during his time here." Holden's jaw tightened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Taylor, first running a saloon, now harboring a potential fugitive. One might begin to question your judgment or your morals." "My judgment and morals are not your concern, Sheriff. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run." As she walked away, Elizabeth's mind raced. Could Ethan really be a wanted man? He'd admitted to drifting for years, to having run-ins with lawmen, but murder? The quiet, thoughtful man who fixed her porch steps and read poetry by lamplight didn't seem capable of cold-blooded killing. But then, what did she really know about Ethan Abbott? When she reached the saloon, she found him sitting on the back steps, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like a small horse. He looked up as she approached, his smile fading when he saw her expression. Church didn't go well, he observed, setting aside his carving. The Reverend took the opportunity to remind the congregation about a woman's proper place. Elizabeth removed her hat, suddenly tired of its weight. And then the sheriff warned me that you might be a wanted murderer. Ethan's face went very still. I see. Is it true? He was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. I've killed men, yes. 3 that I know of for certain. One was trying to rob me on the trail outside Santa Fe. The second was beating a woman half to death in a Kansas saloon. The third, he paused, his eyes distant. The third was in El Paso, a gambler who didn't like losing. He drew on me first in front of 20 witnesses. Self-defense then, not murder, in the eyes of the law maybe. In the eyes of God, Ethan shrugged. I've made my peace with my sins as best I can, and your name is Ethan Abbott, who you really are. At this, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. It's the name my mother gave me, yes, though I've used others when necessary. Elizabeth considered this, trying to reconcile the man before her with the dangerous fugitive the sheriff had described. Why come to Copper Creek? Why stay and work for meager wages when you could move on? Ethan met her gaze directly. At first, it was just another stop. Somewhere to rest before moving on, but then I met you, a widow who wouldn't be silenced, who faced down a town rather than surrender her independence. His voice softened. A woman unlike any I've encountered in all my travels. The raw honesty in his words made Elizabeth's breath catch. The sheriff will be watching you now. If there are warrants, he'll find them. There are no warrants, Ethan assured her. At least none that still matter. The men I killed all drew first, all in front of witnesses. But Holden won't let that stop him if he's determined to run me out of town or lock you up. That too. Ethan stood, brushing wood shavings from his trousers. Perhaps it would be better for you if I moved on. The thought of Ethan leaving sent a sharp pang through Elizabeth's chest, surprising her with its intensity. Is that what you want? What I want? He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. What I want hasn't mattered for a long time, Betsy. But if you're asking if I want to leave you, then no, I don't. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken feelings. Elizabeth knew she should step back, maintain the proper distance between employer and employee, between a recent widow and a man with a complicated past. Instead, she found herself saying, then stay, at least until we know what the sheriff plans to do. Ethan searched her face, looking for something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once. I'll stay for as long as you'll have me. The days leading up to the town council meeting were tense with anticipation. Elizabeth threw herself into preparing for the confrontation, reviewing the saloon's books and gathering evidence of its improved condition and finances. Ethan continued his work around the property, though he was careful to remain out of sight when Sheriff Holden made his increasingly frequent patrols past the Silver Spur. The night before the meeting, Elizabeth sat at the small desk in her home, drafting notes for her address to the council. A soft knock at her door startled her from her concentration. "Who is it?" she called, reaching for the small derringer she kept in her desk drawer. "It's Ethan." Relief flooded her as she moved to open the door. Ethan stood on her porch, holding something wrapped in brown paper. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, "but I wanted to give you this before tomorrow." Elizabeth invited him inside, conscious of how improper it was to receive a man alone in her home after dark, but beyond caring what the town might think. "What is it?" she asked as he handed her the package, something that might help. She unwrapped the paper to find a beautifully carved wooden plaque bearing the words Silver Spur Saloon in elegant lettering, with established 1868 and proprietress, Elizabeth Taylor, beneath it. "Oh, Ethan," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful. Thought it might remind the council that the Silver Spur has been a part of this town for years, he explained, and that its current owner has every right to be recognized as a legitimate businesswoman. Elizabeth placed the sign carefully on her desk, then turned back to Ethan with shining eyes. Thank you, not just for this, but for everything these past weeks. I don't know how I would have managed without your help. You'd have managed, he said with quiet confidence. You're stronger than you know, Betsy Taylor. His faith in her warmed something deep inside that had been cold for too long. Without thinking, Elizabeth stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating steady and strong beneath her palm. No one has ever seen me the way you do, she whispered. Ethan covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I see a woman of rare courage and intelligence, a woman any man would be proud to stand beside. The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Elizabeth knew she should step away, should remember her status as a widow, her vulnerability as a woman alone in a hostile town. But for once, she didn't want to be practical or proper. She wanted to follow the pull that had been drawing her toward Ethan since the first night he'd defended her. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, Ethan lowered his head. His lips met hers with exquisite gentleness, a question more than a demand. Elizabeth answered by sliding her hand to his shoulder, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened into something neither of them had expected to find in Copper Creek. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Elizabeth rested her forehead against his chest, unable to look at him while her heart was so plainly visible in her eyes. I shouldn't have done that, she murmured. It's too soon after Richard, too complicated with everything else. Ethan's hand came up to stroke her hair, the gesture achingly tender. I know, and I won't press you for more than you're ready to give, but I won't apologize for kissing you, Betsy. I've wanted to since the moment I saw you stand up to that sheriff. Elizabeth looked up at him then, finding only honest affection in his gaze. The timing couldn't be worse. The timing is what it is, he said simply. We'll face tomorrow's troubles tomorrow. Tonight, he brushed a strand of hair from her face. Tonight, I just wanted you to know you're not alone. With one more gentle kiss to her forehead, Ethan stepped back. I should go. You need your rest before the council meeting. Elizabeth nodded, though everything in her wanted him to stay. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Betsy. He paused at the door. Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm with you. After he left, Elizabeth stood in the center of her small parlor, fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from his kiss. For the first time since coming to Copper Creek as Richard's bride, she felt truly seen not as a possession or an ornament, but as a woman of substance and worth. Whatever the town council decided tomorrow, she would face it with that knowledge secure in her heart. The town hall was packed when Elizabeth arrived for the council meeting. It seemed every resident of Copper Creek had turned out to witness the confrontation between the widow Taylor and the town's established leadership. Elizabeth wore her best black dress, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat, determined to present an image of respectability despite the whispers that followed her down the aisle. Ethan had offered to accompany her, but she decided against it. This was her fight, and bringing a man, especially one under the sheriff's suspicion, would only reinforce the notion that she couldn't stand on her own. The 5 members of the town council sat at a long table at the front of the room. Harold Weathers from the bank, Reverend Mitchell, doctor. Simmons, the town's only physician. Jeremiah Porter, who owned the general store, and Mayor Thomas Williams, a former miner who had struck it moderately rich and now lived on his investments. Mayor Williams called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. First item of business, the matter of the Silver Spur Saloon and its current situation. Elizabeth sat straight-backed in the front row as Harold Weathers rose to speak. Fellow citizens of Copper Creek, the banker began pompously, we face an unprecedented situation. For the first time in our town's history, a respectable establishment is being operated by a woman, a widow still in mourning, no less. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Weathers continued, painting a grim picture of moral decay and the undermining of traditional values. Reverend Mitchell followed with biblical quotations about women's proper roles, and Dr. Simmons offered pseudo-scientific warnings about the strain such unnatural activities placed on the delicate female constitution. By the time Elizabeth was invited to speak, the atmosphere in the hall was decidedly hostile. She approached the front of the room, conscious of every eye upon her, and placed her notes carefully on the small lectern. "Gentlemen of the council, citizens of Copper Creek," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I stand before you today not as a revolutionary or a troublemaker, but as a businesswoman seeking to make an honest living." She proceeded to outline the improvements she'd made to the Silver Spur in the short time since taking over the repairs, the improved quality of whiskey, the reduction in fights and disturbances. She presented figures showing increased profits and the positive impact on other local businesses when miners and cowboys came to town for her establishment. "Furthermore," she continued, "I would remind the council that there is no law in the Arizona Territory prohibiting a woman from owning or operating a business. Indeed, many widows throughout the West have successfully run boarding houses, shops, and yes, even saloons, following their husbands' deaths." "There's a difference between necessity and choice, Mrs. Taylor," Mayor Williams interrupted. "No one would object to a destitute widow taking in laundry or running a respectable boarding house, but you've chosen to place yourself in an environment unsuitable for any decent woman." "I've chosen to preserve the business my husband built," Elizabeth countered. "A business that provides employment for others and tax revenue for this town." Reverend Mitchell leaned forward. "And what of your immortal soul, Mrs. Taylor? What of the example you set for the young women of Copper Creek?" "I believe my soul is between myself and God, Reverend. As for my example, I would hope the young women of this town learn that they need not be helpless or dependent when faced with adversity." Harold Weathers cleared his throat importantly. "The fact remains, Mrs. Taylor, that the Silver Spurs loan is in default. The bank has every right to foreclose on the property. The terms of the loan allow for a 30-day grace period which has not yet expired," Elizabeth replied calmly. "Moreover, I've made significant progress toward the required payment, as my records show." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with each council member raising objections and Elizabeth refuting them one by one. The crowd's mood shifted gradually as they watched her stand her ground with dignity and intelligence against the men's increasingly petty arguments. Finally, Mayor Williams called for a vote on the proposal to revoke the Silver Spur's business license on grounds of public morality. Elizabeth held her breath as each council member cast his vote. Weathers, "Aye." Mitchell, "Aye." Simmons, "Aye." Porter hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "Nay." All eyes turned to Mayor Williams for the deciding vote. The mayor studied Elizabeth for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Taylor, no one can deny that you've conducted yourself with surprising competence in this matter. But traditions exist for good reasons, and Copper Creek has always been a town that respects tradition." Elizabeth's heart sank. She'd lost. "However," the mayor continued, "we are also a town that respects property rights and free enterprise. My vote is nay. The motion fails." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by scattered applause and grumbling. Elizabeth could hardly believe what she'd heard. "Thank you, Mayor," she managed to say, her voice steady despite her shock. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Taylor," Williams cautioned. "The council will be implementing new regulations for all businesses serving alcohol, including higher licensing fees and stricter operating hours. These will apply equally to all establishments, of course." It was a compromise. She could keep her business, but at a higher cost. Still, it was a victory Elizabeth hadn't dared hope for. As the meeting adjourned and people began to file out, Elizabeth gathered her papers, still slightly dazed by the outcome. She was surprised when Jeremiah Porter approached her. "That was well argued, Mrs. Taylor," the shopkeeper said quietly. "For what it's worth, I've seen an uptick in business since you took over the Silver Spur. More folks coming to town means more customers for all of us." "Thank you for your vote, Mr. Porter," he shrugged. "Business is business. Besides, my late mother ran our family store for 15 years after my father passed. Would have been hypocritical of me to vote against you for doing the same." As Elizabeth left the town hall, she spotted Ethan waiting across the street, leaning against a hitching post with casual grace. The sight of him solid, steady, waiting for her filled her with unexpected joy. "You won," he said as she approached, his eyes warm with pride, for now at least. "The bank can still foreclose if I don't make the payment. But you've bought time and respect." Ethan offered his arm. "May I walk you home, Mrs. Taylor?" Elizabeth placed her hand on his arm, no longer caring what the townspeople might think. "Yes, Mr. Abbott, you may." As they walked through the dusty streets of Copper Creek, Elizabeth felt lighter than she had in years. She'd faced the town's disapproval and emerged victorious, if not unscathed. And beside her walked a man who saw her strength rather than resenting it. For the first time since Richard's death, the future seemed full of possibility rather than dread. That evening, the Silver Spur was busier than ever. It seemed everyone in town wanted to see the woman who had defied the council and won. Some came to gawk, others to offer grudging congratulations, and a surprising number to drink and gamble as they always had, apparently unconcerned with the gender of the establishment's owner. Elizabeth moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, serving drinks and exchanging pleasantries, while Ethan and Hank kept everything running smoothly. She noticed several council members among the patrons, including Mayor Williams, who tipped his hat to her with something like respect in his eyes. Just after 9, the Batwing doors swung open to admit Sheriff Holden and 2 unfamiliar men. The trio scanned the room before the sheriff pointed toward the bar where Ethan was serving drinks. Elizabeth's heart sank as she recognized the badges on the strangers' chests, U.S. Marshals. She hurried toward them, but the marshals had already reached Ethan. The taller of the two spoke loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. "Ethan Abbott, I'm Marshal James Harker. This is Deputy Marshal Wilson. We need to have a word with you outside." Ethan wiped his hands calmly on a bar towel. "What's this about, Marshal? Outside, if you please." Harker's hand rested meaningfully on his gun. Elizabeth reached them, her voice tight with anxiety. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Sheriff Holden looked smugly triumphant. "These marshals have been tracking Abbott for some time, Mrs. Taylor. Seems your employee has quite a history." Ethan's eyes met Elizabeth's briefly before he nodded to the marshals. "Let's take this outside, as the marshal suggests." As Ethan moved toward the door, the entire saloon fell silent, all eyes following the confrontation. Elizabeth hurried after them, pushing through the crowd that had gathered on the boardwalk outside to witness the drama. In the street, illuminated by the yellow lights spilling from the saloon windows, Marshal Harker faced Ethan with grim determination. "Ethan Abbott, also known as Ethan Blackwood, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Jackson Willis in El Paso, Texas, last November." Elizabeth gasped at the name Blackwood, not Abbott. Ethan had lied about his surname after all. "There's been a mistake," Ethan said calmly. "My name is Ethan Abbott, not Blackwood, and the shooting in El Paso was self-defense, witnessed by at least 20 people." "That's not for us to decide," Harker replied. "We have a warrant signed by a judge. You'll get your chance to tell your side in court." Sheriff Holden smirked. "I told you he was trouble, Mrs. Taylor, a murderer hiding right under your nose." Elizabeth ignored him, stepping forward. "Marshal Harker, Mr. Abbott has been employed at my establishment for nearly a month. During that time, he's proven himself to be an honest and hardworking man. If there's been violence in his past, I'm certain it was justified." "Stand aside, madam," the deputy warned. "This isn't your concern. It most certainly is my concern when you arrest a man on my property without proper cause." Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle despite the tension in his body. "It's all right, Betsy. I'll go peacefully and sort this out." "The hell you will," she retorted, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. "Not without a proper explanation." Marshal Harker sighed. "Mrs. Taylor, we have a sworn statement from a witness claiming Abbott or Blackwood shot Willis in cold blood during a card game. The territorial governor has authorized his extradition to Texas to stand trial." "And who is this witness?" Elizabeth demanded. That information is confidential." A new voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. It was me. The onlookers parted to reveal Harold Weathers, his face flushed with either triumph or embarrassment. Elizabeth couldn't tell which. "I was in El Paso last November on bank business," Weathers continued. "I witnessed the shooting at the Golden Palace Saloon. I recognized Abbott as soon as he arrived in town, but it took time to confirm my suspicions and contact the proper authorities." Elizabeth stared at the banker in disbelief. "You've orchestrated this, because I wouldn't sell the saloon." "I've merely done my civic duty," Weathers replied stiffly. "A dangerous man is in our midst." Ethan's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Weathers wasn't in El Paso that night. He's lying." The banker's face reddened further. "How dare you? I saw you shoot that man in cold blood." "Describe the saloon," Ethan challenged quietly. "What? The Golden Palace. Describe it if you were there." Weathers hesitated. It was like any saloon, bar along one wall, tables for cards. "The Golden Palace has a circular bar in the center of the room," Ethan said, his voice carrying to the entire crowd. "Anyone who's been there would know that. And the man I shot, Willis, pulled his gun first after accusing me of cheating. The dealer and 5 other players testified to that effect." A ripple of uncertainty passed through the onlookers. Marshall Harker frowned, looking between Ethan and Weathers. "Is this true?" he asked the banker. "Were you actually there?" Weathers spluttered, his composure cracking. "Aye, that is. The details are foggy after so many months, but I'm certain it was him." Sheriff Holden stepped forward. "Regardless of the specifics, Marshal, you have a valid warrant. The courts can sort out the truth." Elizabeth had heard enough. She pushed past the lawman to stand beside Ethan, facing the crowd. "This is nothing but a shameful attempt to run me out of business by targeting the one person who's helped me succeed. Harold Weathers has made no secret of his desire to acquire the silver spur for the bank, and he's using false accusations to achieve what he couldn't accomplish legally today." "Strong accusations, Mrs. Taylor," Mayor Williams said, emerging from the crowd. "Mr. Weathers is a respected member of our community. A respected member who's willing to perjure himself to get what he wants," Elizabeth retorted. "I challenge him to produce any evidence he was in El Paso last November. Travel receipts, hotel bills, witnesses to his presence, anything at all." All eyes turned to Weathers, who tugged at his collar nervously. "This is absurd. I don't need to prove myself to you, Mrs. Taylor." "Perhaps not to me," Elizabeth agreed, "but surely to the U.S. Marshals before they arrest an innocent man on your word alone." Marshal Harker studied Weathers with growing suspicion. "The lady raises a fair point, Mr. Weathers. Do you have any documentation of your trip to El Paso?" The banker's silence was damning. After a long moment, Mayor Williams stepped forward. "Marshal, as mayor of Copper Creek, I request that you verify the accuracy of this warrant before proceeding. If Mr. Weathers has made false statements, that's a serious matter for our town to address." Harker exchanged glances with his deputy before nodding reluctantly. "We'll hold Mr. Abbott in custody overnight while we telegraph El Paso for confirmation. If his story checks out, he'll be released with our apologies." "And if Weathers is found to have filed a false report," Elizabeth pressed. "Then he'll face charges of his own," the marshal assured her grimly. As the lawman led Ethan away, he caught Elizabeth's eye once more. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet confidence that left her both worried and hopeful. The crowd dispersed slowly, buzzing with the latest drama to unfold in Copper Creek. Elizabeth found herself surrounded by a small group of supporters, including Martha Wilson from the library and, surprisingly, Jeremiah Porter from the general store. "That took courage, standing up to the marshals like that," Porter said. "Weathers has always been too big for his britches, if you ask me." Martha patted Elizabeth's arm. "We'll help however we can, dear. That young man of yours doesn't strike me as a cold-blooded killer." "He's not my young man," Elizabeth protested weakly, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Whatever you say, dear. Now, what can we do to help clear his name?" With unexpected allies at her side, Elizabeth returned to the saloon. her mind already racing with plans to prove Ethan's innocence and expose Weathers' deception. The night had taken an unwelcome turn, but she was no longer alone in her fight. For the first time, she truly believed that Copper Creek might eventually become home after all. Elizabeth spent a restless night alternating between worry for Ethan and fury at Weathers' underhanded tactics. By dawn, she had formulated a plan. She dressed quickly and made her way to the telegraph office as soon as it opened, sending messages to the Golden Palace Saloon in El Paso and to the Territorial Marshal's office requesting confirmation of Ethan's account of the shooting. Next, she visited the small jail where Ethan was being held. Sheriff Holden initially refused to let her see him, but Marshal Harker overruled him, allowing her 5 minutes under supervision. Ethan looked tired but unharmed, his smile warming when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here, Betsy. It's not proper for a lady to visit the jail." "Propriety be damned," she said softly. "Are they treating you well?" "Well enough. The Marshal's a fair man, despite the circumstances." Ethan leaned closer to the bars. "You should know my real name is Abbott, not Blackwood. Weathers fabricated that detail along with everything else. I've sent telegrams to El Paso. With luck, we'll have confirmation of your story by nightfall." Ethan's eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Whatever happens, Betsy, these past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Don't talk like that. You'll be free by tomorrow, and Weathers will be the one facing charges. Your faith in me is humbling." He reached through the bars to touch her cheek briefly. "Most would have believed the worst at the first sign of trouble." "Most haven't seen the man I've seen," Elizabeth replied simply. "The man who fixes broken steps before dawn and carves wooden signs by lamplight." Their time was cut short by Sheriff Holden announcing that her visit was over. As Elizabeth reluctantly turned to leave, Ethan called after her, "Betsy, be careful. Weathers has more to lose than just the bank's money in this." She nodded, understanding his warning. If Weathers had fabricated evidence against Ethan, there was no telling what else he might do to protect himself. Throughout the day, Elizabeth divided her time between the saloon and gathering support among the townspeople. To her surprise, many were sympathetic to her cause, particularly after the previous day's council meeting had revealed the extent of Weathers' determination to acquire the silver spur. Martha Wilson proved to be an unexpected ally, using her extensive network of friends and borrowers to spread the word about Weathers' deception. Jeremiah Porter quietly examined the bank's ledger from his time on the town finance committee, looking for irregularities in Weathers' accounting. By late afternoon, Elizabeth was serving drinks at the saloon when a breathless young boy burst through the doors. "Mrs. Taylor, telegram for you from El Paso." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she accepted the folded paper, tipping the boy generously before tearing it open. "Confirm Ethan Abbott cleared in shooting Stop Willis, drew first witnessed by 20 Stop no charges filed Stop no one named Blackwood involved Stop Marshal Dawson El Paso." Relief flooded through her. She had the proof they needed to free Ethan and expose Weathers. She was about to leave for the jail when Jeremiah Porter hurried into the saloon, his normally placid face flushed with excitement. "Mrs. Taylor, I've found something you need to see." He spread several papers on the bar bank records showing substantial sums moving between accounts under Weathers' control. "He's been embezzling from the bank for years," Porter explained. "Small amounts at first, but larger recently. Your husband discovered it shortly before his death. There are notes in his hand questioning these transactions." Elizabeth stared at the papers, pieces falling into place. "Richard confronted him, didn't he?" That's why Weathers was so eager to foreclose on the saloon, not just for the property, but to cover up the evidence Richard found. "It appears so. And with you running the place successfully and asking questions about the finances, you became an even greater threat." Elizabeth gathered the papers and the telegram. "We need to take these to Marshal Harker immediately." As they hurried toward the jail, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the alley behind the bank. Marshal Harker studied the telegram and bank records with growing concern while Sheriff Holden shifted uncomfortably beside him. "This is serious evidence of both fraud and false accusation," Harker said finally. "We'll need to bring Mr. Weathers in for questioning immediately." Elizabeth stood her ground. "And Ethan should be released at once. He's been falsely imprisoned based on Weathers' lies." The marshal nodded. "Deputy Wilson, please release Mr. Abbott with our apologies. Sheriff Holden, you'll accompany me to arrest Harold Weathers." Sheriff Holden cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should stay here while you and the deputy handle Weathers. In case of trouble," Harker's eyes narrowed. "Are you refusing to do your duty, Sheriff?" "No, sir. Just suggesting a more prudent distribution of manpower." Before the marshal could respond, the door burst open and one of Holden's deputies stumbled in, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. "Sheriff, Weathers is making a run for it. He's cleaned out the bank vault and stolen a horse. Knocked me down when I tried to stop him." Everything happened quickly after that. Ethan was released from his cell while Marshal Harker organized a posse to pursue Weathers. To Elizabeth's dismay, Ethan immediately volunteered to join the pursuit. "You don't have to do this," she protested as he checked the ammunition in his revolver. "You've been locked up because of that man's lies. Let the marshals handle it." Ethan's expression was resolute. "Weathers is desperate and armed. The marshals could use an extra gun, and I want to see this through." His voice softened. "I'll be careful, Betsy, I promise." Before she could argue further, he leaned down and kissed her, quick and fierce, in full view of everyone present. "For luck," he murmured against her lips before joining the posse assembling outside. Elizabeth watched them ride out of town, her heart in her throat. After everything they'd been through, after finally finding proof of Ethan's innocence and Weathers' guilt, she couldn't bear the thought of losing him to a stray bullet from a desperate man. The hours of waiting were torture. Elizabeth paced the floor of the saloon, unable to focus on business despite the steady stream of customers eager for news. Hank handled the bar while she alternated between watching the street and checking the clock. Just after sunset, the sound of approaching horses drew her to the door. The posse was returning, riders dusty and weary. Elizabeth scanned their faces anxiously, her heart seizing when she didn't immediately spot Ethan among them. Then the crowd parted, and she saw him dismounting slowly, favoring his left side but alive. Behind him, slumped across a horse with his hands bound, was Harold Weathers. Elizabeth rushed forward as Ethan handed his reins to a deputy. "You're hurt," he winced as she touched his arm. "Just a graze. Weathers was a better shot than I expected. He shot you. Tried to. We caught up to him at Willow Creek. He chose to fight rather than surrender." Ethan's expression was grim. "Nearly got Marshal Harker, but the marshal's faster than he looks." Elizabeth helped Ethan into the saloon and upstairs to his room, where she insisted on treating his wound herself. The bullet had indeed just grazed his upper arm, leaving an angry furrow that bled freely but wasn't life-threatening. As she cleaned and bandaged the injury, Elizabeth found herself alternating between relief that he was safe and fury that he'd risked himself at all. "You could have been killed," she said, tying off the bandage with perhaps more force than necessary. "So could you when you stood up to the council, or when you confronted Weathers and the marshals." Ethan caught her hand as she pulled away. "We both do what needs doing, Betsy. It's one of the things I admire most about you." The anger drained out of her, replaced by a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. "What happens now, with Weathers, I mean, he'll stand trial for embezzlement, false accusation, and attempting to kill a federal marshal. He won't trouble Copper Creek again." Ethan's thumb traced gentle circles on her wrist. "As for us," Elizabeth's heart quickened. "Yes, that depends on you. I came to Copper Creek with no plans to stay, no expectation of finding anything but a temporary job and a place to rest before moving on." His eyes held hers, open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Instead, I found you. And what does that mean to you?" Elizabeth asked softly. "It means I love you, Elizabeth Taylor. It means I want to stay if you'll have me not as your employee, but as your partner. In business and in life." The declaration took her breath away. She'd known there was something growing between them, something powerful and unexpected, but hearing him speak the words made it real in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. "It's too soon," she whispered, though she made no move to pull her hand from his. I'm still in mourning. The town already thinks I'm scandalous for running the saloon if I were to entertain your offer so soon after Richard's death. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, Ethan assured her. Only to consider the possibility. I've lived my life on the move, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, but you make me want to build something lasting, Betsy, something real. Elizabeth looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the steady warmth that had been her anchor through the tumultuous weeks since they'd met. She thought of Richard not with grief, but with a clear-eyed understanding of what their marriage had truly been. She thought of the life she was building for herself, the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain, and she realized that loving Ethan wouldn't diminish that independence, it would strengthen it. He didn't want to control her or change her. He wanted to stand beside her, facing whatever came together. I love you too, she admitted, the words feeling right as they left her lips. But I need time to finish my mourning properly, time to establish the saloon as my own. Can you give me that? Ethan's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I've waited my whole life to find you, Betsy Taylor. I can wait a little longer to claim you. He drew her gently into his arms, mindful of his injury, and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. It was a promise, a beginning, a glimpse of the future they might build together. The months that followed brought many changes to Copper Creek and to Elizabeth's life. Harold Weathers was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. The bank temporarily closed until a new manager could be appointed from Phoenix, throwing the town into financial uncertainty. Elizabeth seized the opportunity to propose a solution. Using the profits from the increasingly successful Silver Spur, she offered to purchase her outstanding loan and several others that were at risk of default due to Weathers' embezzlement. Her proposal, presented to the town council with Ethan at her side, was met with initial skepticism but eventual approval. By spring of 1873, Elizabeth Taylor was not only the owner of the most profitable saloon in 3 counties, but also a significant creditor to many of Copper Creek's businesses. The whispers that had once condemned her as trouble now acknowledged her as a savvy businesswoman whose intervention had saved the town from economic collapse. Through it all, Ethan remained at her side officially as the saloon's manager, unofficially as her closest confidant and the keeper of her heart. He supervised the expansion of the Silver Spur to include a proper restaurant and additional guest rooms, transforming it from a simple saloon into a full-service hotel that attracted travelers and businessmen from across the territory. Their relationship remained proper in the public eye, with Ethan maintaining separate quarters, and Elizabeth continuing to wear the black of mourning through the customary year. But in private moments, late nights reviewing ledgers, early mornings sharing coffee on the back porch, quiet rides into the desert on their days off, their bond deepened beyond anything either had experienced before. Exactly 1 year after Richard's death, Elizabeth donned colors again, for the first time a deep blue dress that brought out the gold in her hair and the sparkle in her eyes. That evening, as the Silver Spur filled with its usual crowd of miners, cowboys, and townspeople, Ethan took her hand and led her to the center of the room. "May I have your attention, please?" he called, his voice carrying over the piano music and conversation. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to the handsome couple in the center. "Most of you know that I came to Copper Creek as a drifter, with no intention of staying," Ethan began. "And most of you know that Mrs. Taylor was initially known as Trouble for speaking her mind and claiming her rightful place in this community." Chuckles and nods greeted this statement. The nickname had become a point of pride in recent months, as Elizabeth's business acumen had proven beneficial to the entire town. "What you may not know," Ethan continued, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face, "is that from the moment I saw her stand up to those who would silence her, I knew she was the bravest woman I'd ever met. And I knew, though I scarcely dared admit it even to myself, that she was mine, or rather, that I was hers, heart and soul, if she would have me. A murmur ran through the crowd as Ethan dropped to one knee, still holding Elizabeth's trembling hand. "Elizabeth Taylor, you've brought purpose and joy to my life when I thought both were beyond my reach. You've shown me what it means to fight for what matters, to build rather than wander, to love without reservation." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring with a modest diamond that caught the lamplight. "Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Elizabeth looked down at this man who had changed everything, this man who had seen her strength as beauty, her outspokenness as courage, her independence as worthy of respect rather than correction. This man who loved her not despite her troublemaking ways, but because of them. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Ethan Abbott." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, the saloon erupted in cheers and applause. Even those who had once criticized her wildest roundly celebrated, swept up in the romance of the moment. Sheriff Holden, who had gradually come to respect both Elizabeth and Ethan in the month since Weather's arrest, raised his glass in a toast. "To the bride and groom, may your marriage be as successful as your business partnership." More toasts followed, more congratulations, more good-natured teasing about how the troublemaking widow had finally found a man brave enough to take her on. Through it all, Elizabeth and Ethan remained at the center, hands linked, faces glowing with a happiness neither had expected to find in this dusty corner of the Arizona Territory. Later, when the celebration had wound down and they stood alone on the back porch beneath a canopy of stars, Ethan drew Elizabeth into his arms. "Are you happy, truly?" he asked softly. "You've worked so hard for your independence. I don't want you to feel you're giving that up." Elizabeth reached up to trace the scar along his jawline, smiling at the concern in his eyes. "I'm not giving up anything by marrying you, Ethan. You've never asked me to be less than I am. You've only ever encouraged me to be more. And you've given me roots when I thought I was destined to drift forever." He pressed a kiss to her palm. "We're better together than apart, always have been from that first night when you stood your ground against the sheriff. And you called me brave," Elizabeth remembered with a smile. "The bravest woman I've ever known," Ethan affirmed, "and mine if you're willing." "I am," she whispered against his lips. "Yours and my own both at once, that's the wonder of it." As they sealed their promise with a kiss beneath the vast desert sky, Elizabeth knew that the path ahead would not always be smooth. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments when the world tried to force them into conventional boxes they didn't fit. But they would face those moments together, the widow once called trouble, and the drifter who had recognized her courage when others saw only defiance. Together, they would build something neither had dared to dream of finding. A love as vast as the western sky, as enduring as the mountains that cradled their town, and as genuine as the hearts that had found each other against all odds in Copper Creek. They were married that autumn in a ceremony that blended tradition with their unique circumstances. Elizabeth wore blue instead of white, carried wildflowers gathered from the desert, and wrote her own vows promising partnership rather than obedience. Ethan, resplendent in a new suit, spoke of finding home not in a place but in a person, in her fierce spirit and loving heart. The entire town turned out for the celebration, transforming the Silver Spur into a flower-decked reception hall where miners danced with shopkeepers' wives, and even Reverend Mitchell unbent enough to wish the couple well, though he still frowned at Elizabeth's unorthodox vows. In the years that followed, Elizabeth and Ethan Abbott became pillars of the Copper Creek community. They expanded the Silver Spur into the finest hotel between Tucson and Phoenix, added a small ranch on the outskirts of town where Ethan bred and trained horses, and eventually welcomed 2 children, a daughter with Elizabeth's spirit and a son with Ethan's quiet strength. Through it all, Elizabeth remained trouble to those who preferred women meek and silent. But to Ethan, to her children, and to the growing number of young women in the Arizona Territory who looked to her example, she was something far more important: proof that a woman could speak her mind, follow her heart, and create a life entirely her own without sacrificing love or happiness. And in the quiet moments, when the day's work was done and they sat together on the porch of the home they'd built. Hands linked as they watched the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson, Elizabeth and Ethan shared a silent gratitude for the unlikely path that had brought them together, a path that began with a widow's defiance, and a drifter's recognition that such courage was rare and precious. "Still think I'm trouble?" Elizabeth would sometimes ask, her head resting on his shoulder, and Ethan would always smile, pressing a kiss to her hair before answering with the words that had begun their journey. "The best kind of trouble, brave and beautiful and mine."